Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Henderson, member of ManaWāhineKōrero in support of petitioner Deb Hayes. We have read the Council's response letter and we believe we owe the re-included words for wahine and pepe to Ms Hayes and the woman who signed her petition, not to any genuine effort to consider feedback on the Council's part. They ignored the first two rounds of feedback and only made changes after advice from lawyers in February. They are being disingenuous with respect to the Minister of Health. They know he is not allowed to direct the scope and they write as if he gave them advice and they heeded it. The scope is due to come into effect in less than a month, which is now tomorrow, and they are embedding it into midwifery education as we speak. We don't have any reason to think they are being transparent and we believe there are important questions in the public interest to be answered. We want to know what the total cost to the public has been and to see a detailed breakdown of what it was spent on. We are especially interested in what the relationship was between the Council's scope and Dr. George Parker's trans pregnancy care project, as mentioned by Deb Hayes. This project was led by Dr. Parker at Victoria University with Dr. Miller at the Otago School of Midwifery. Both projects overlapped for a year and a half and used almost identical language, sometimes to the point of farce. For example, 2 years ago in November 22, Dr. Parker uploaded a publicly available YouTube video discussing her trans pregnancy care project. She said her team was, quote, hearing clearly from inside midwifery that they needed professional bodies to lead and mandate cultural humility in relation to trans and non-binary people, and closed by pronouncing that it wasn't a case of if midwifery had to go on this journey, but that they had to go on this journey. 3 days later, the Council uploaded the new scope of practice to their website, mandating the removal of all the words for women, along with a story of their work called Our Journey. We also want to know if Dr. Parker's research partner, Dr. Miller, is still on the Midwifery Council's Professional Conduct Committee. Nobody who wants to mandate cultural humility should be on a conduct committee. What was Dr. Elizabeth Kirikiri's involvement with the scope of practice? She was an advisor to the Trans Pregnancy Care Project while she was a sitting MP and earned her philosophy degree, saying that there is no evidence of gender identity in pre-colonial Te Ao Māori, and then earning her living saying the opposite. Did she get paid for this work with Dr. Parker? The scope is supposed to be free of political involvement. The other person of note who consulted on the Trans Pregnancy Project was Mr. Jamie Veal, who runs the Trans Healthcare Research Lab at the University of Waikato. His master's thesis was titled Love of Oneself as a Woman and was concerned entirely with sexual proclivities, with transvestism, fetishism, sadism, and more. He is the president of PATHA and secretary of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, who, it cannot be said enough, support the idea that eunuch is a sexuality and who promoted the Eunuch Archives, a violent, fetishistic porn site where young boys have been abused and castrated. See the WPATH files. Has Mr. Veal ever advised the Midwifery Council or the Scope Project team on any matter? Did Dr. Parker's Trans Pregnancy Care Project provide the evidence base for the scope? Dr. Parker and Dr. Miller also co-authored a research paper on midwives supporting trans people with chest feeding. Once again, they released their work within days of the Council's scope in November 23. The introduction to this paper begins, not all people who breastfeed/chest feed are women, yet every person who hopes to feed a baby from their body deserves the information, care and support required to do so. No, they don't. Men do not have this right. Babies have rights too. Only women can feed babies from their bodies, and the word is breastfeeding. The doctors write that midwives have an important role in supporting breastfeeding and that, quote, this is clearly identified within the Midwifery Council scope of practice, which was the one in 2022, which had no women in it. Breastfeeding is not mentioned in the Council's scope of practice, even now in 24. Returning the favour, the Midwifery Council provided them with a definition of whānau, the first two lines of which are, whānau is an inclusive term that is used to recognise the diversity of individuals within their social context. Whānau is a word indigenous to Aotearoa, New Zealand. That is not what the Council said it means in their letter, and it is a word indigenous to Māori. Finally, Drs. Parker, Kirikiri and Miller, all doctors of philosophy, wrote to the Spin-Off in January this year in passionate defence of the scope, saying it was, quote, focused on whānau rather than individual women/mothers and babies as the key relationship in care provision. The Council, meanwhile, told this committee that the midwife's primary focus is on wahine and pepe and always was. We want to keep our midwifery service and our inspirational midwives in the model of care we have, but we want them to have a good council, and at the moment we think the council is in breach of the HPCAA. We believe their behaviour and statements warrant the interim cessation of work on the scope and an open government inquiry with public debate as described. We think, as we approach the 131st anniversary next week of suffragettes Merititai Mangakahia and Kate Shepherd's win for our right to vote, that as we're here today fighting for the definitions of the words wahine and woman, that this is a reasonable thing to ask for. We hope you will agree, and I will hand you now over to Di.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I am Diane Landy, co-founder of ManaWāhineKōrero, in support of petitioner and midwife Deb Hayes. As you know, ManaWāhineKōrero rejects the Midwifery Council's revised scope of practice and their interpretation of our culture. In short, the word whānau, commonly understood as family, has been translated by the council so poorly that it has resulted in an unresolvable cultural contradiction in the scope and has to be accompanied by an explanatory paragraph. This has been caused by a lack of open national consultation with all wahine Māori, not just the tiny handful, and the Midwifery Council's commitment not to clinical goals, but to social engineering. The council would like whānau to mean wahine hapu, pregnant person, in their social context, but it doesn't. Wahine and whānau are not interchangeable words. Whānau is the smallest familial unit within the iwi structure of iwi, hapu, and then whānau. Whānau is indivisible from whakapapa, from historical ties of blood, and intermarriage from our tūpuna, our ancestors and descendants. Wahine are the house of humanity in Te Ao. We are whare tangata and venerated for bearing life. All of our stories, artwork, music, and every word in Te Reo tells us that only wahine become pregnant and give birth. Only wahine become mothers. To say otherwise is to undermine our tenets of belief and unravel the entirety of our culture, practiced and passed down through the centuries. It is incompatible with Te Ao to suggest, as the scope does, that there are people who are not women who have babies. By using whānau this way to mean pregnant woman or people, the council relegates the sacred role of wahine in our ability to bear children to an uncertain position and allows for the provision of midwifery care that sublimates the needs of wahine and our pepe to the desires of the people around them. The council's definition of whānau also appears to render the word redundant in the scope. If we use their definition, every time they say whānau alongside pregnant woman, they are saying they want midwives to care for pregnant woman and pregnant woman in their social context. None of the council's explanations for their use of whānau withstand close inspection. What does this mean for the pregnant wahine in prison? Who will be her whānau, according to the council? How will this help wahine who have had little exposure to te reo? The council is saying they want to fix the negative legacies of colonisation by tinkering with our language, the foundation of our family structure and our mothers. How can this possibly uphold our mana and mātauranga? We find that the translations and uses of the other te reo words in the scope are improper as well, especially kahu pōkai. We know that this new term for midwife was gifted to the council by the husband of a senior midwife in the College of Midwives, who also somehow found himself appointed to the scope development team as a consumer. Kahu pōkai is already being used in all the council's publications and has replaced old, still living words in te reo that are understood as midwife. But it is impossible to get midwife from kahu pōkai, and both kahu and pōkai have associated definitions that when applied to the midwifery workforce are unsettling, sinister, or simply out of place. Why doesn't the word for midwife in te reo in the scope actually mean midwife? What was wrong with our original words? Why, when the council is so interested in balance and representation, did their February revisions include deleting the te reo version of the scope? The council has relentlessly referenced te tiriti o Waitangi throughout the scope development. We remind them and everyone here that the Treaty of Waitangi does not say, imply, suggest, encourage, or permit the deletion or redefinition of any of our words. We think it is the Council who have misunderstood the problem with their scope, not us. They have been tinkering around with this vanity project for the last 5 years, while our national mother and baby death statistics have remained exactly the same. Wahine Māori and all New Zealand women deserve better than this. As co-founder of ManaWāhineKōrero, I believe Deb Hayes is right and that there should be an open government inquiry into the scope in the Midwifery Council. We believe all wahine and women in New Zealand of every origin should have a chance to hear and contribute to this crucially important scope of practice. We would also like to note that the select committee we're presenting today, it did comprise of 4 koiwi men, and then they put 1 woman in, which I found quite disrespectful because childbirth and pregnancy is women's business. Midwives' core roles have always been mother and baby and should stay this way. Noho tūturu, noho tangata.
Wow. Okay. Great to hear. Great to hear that. What a fantastic